Hi, my name is Ariel, and this is my Spanish contrastive analysis project. I'll start by going over a little bit about the origin and the history of the Spanish language. So Spanish is the native language of more than 400 million people. It is the official language of 20 countries and Puerto Rico. It is a Romance language that evolved primarily from Vulgar Latin, and Spanish colonization brought the language to the Americas in the 16th century. Major Spanish dialects. So here we've listed the main dialects. This is not all of them. Starting with Spain, the official language of northern and central Spain is Castilian. Looking at the map, you can see here in Spain all the purple areas speak Castilian, so that is almost all of Spain. The second most prevalent language is Andalusian. Here they omit the consonants D and R, and the dropping of the final consonant sounds creates a softer sound than Castilian does. In the Canary Islands, they speak Canarian, as you can see here in red on the map. This is a little bit different from the other dialects because they pronounce the letter H, and a lot of the vocabulary is influenced by those that speak Portuguese. Other important dialects include Latin American Spanish. This is the dialect of the majority of Central and South American countries and Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. So the difference between this dialect and those in Spain is very comparable to the difference between the way English sounds in the US and the way it sounds in Britain. So speakers of both can understand each other, but there's clear differences in pronunciation. There's also Rio Platense Spanish, which is spoken in the river basin region between Argentina and Uruguay. And there's Caribbean Spanish, which is spoken in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and on the east coast of Mexico and Central America. As for interesting facts, about 550 million people speak Spanish. About 78 million people speak it as a second language. Mexico is the largest Spanish-speaking country. E is the most used letter in Spanish. And Spanish is the second most studied language in the world. Latin and Arabic have highly influenced the Spanish language, and there have been 11 Literature Nobel Prizes in Spanish. If you look here at the chart, the projected growth of the Hispanic population in the U.S. is supposed to reach 100 million by 2050, and also by 2050 the U.S. is predicted to become the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. As for phonology, I've broken this down into vowels and consonants. So starting with vowels, and it's important to note that the airstream is not impeded when vowel sounds are created. So this is just like English. Nasalization of vowels happens when the vellum lowers and air passes through the nasal cavity. If you look up here at the top chart, this shows that the vowel system has 5 meaningful positions, and they can be drawn as a triangle. So you have front, central, and back, and then high, mid, and low. If you look at the bottom of the triangle at A, this is low central. The next vowel being E, which is mid central. And then here at the top left is I, which is high front. And then at the other side of the triangle you have A, which is mid back. And then U, which is high back. As for consonants, I'll start by talking about the B and V sounds. So these are very similar, but a way to differentiate is to know that B is at the beginning of a breath group. So an example would be the word boda, which is wedding, and you can hear the b right at the beginning. B is a bilabial fricative, and here the lips do not touch. And if you say the word NVR, you'll notice that your lips do not touch. There are 2 sounds associated with the consonant C. So you have the k sound and the s sound. Sound comes before the vowels A, O, and U, or A, O, U. An example would be casa. Here you can see the vowel A or A, and that is why you have the k sound in the C. There's also the S sound, and this comes before the vowels E and I, or E and I, for example, in the word cinco. As for the letters Z, S, and C, when they come before the vowels E and I, they sometimes sound similar. So an example would be the words zapato, shoe, salon, class, and cello, stamp. Morphology. So gender and number in adjectives and nouns. Regular adjectives and nouns have gender, male or female, and they have number, so they can be singular or plural. So one example would be the noun pero, dog, which is masculine, and it has different derivations that make them plural, such as para, peros, and peras. If you look here at the adjective endings chart, you can see masculine, feminine, singular, and plural. So masculine singular could be o, while masculine plural could be os, and feminine singular could be a, and feminine plural could be as. As for negatives, in Spanish, the negative adverb comes before the verb. This can cause problems when transferring to English. So, for example, saying no understand or no do my homework last night. Spanish speakers also use double negatives, where English speakers do not. So, for example, one wouldn't say, I did not do nothing, because this would actually mean that you did do something. So, syntax. There are several acceptable word orders in Spanish, which is not necessarily true in English. There's a lot less flexibility. So, sometimes the subject and the verb in a sentence can be inverted, and this can have implications when Spanish speakers are learning English. So, for an example, the arrived the fireman 10 minutes later versus the fireman arrived 10 minutes later. Here in English, it only makes sense to say the fireman arrived 10 minutes later, whereas in Spanish, both of these translations would make sense, which can lead to some confusion. In Spanish, adjectives tend to follow the noun. So instead of saying the White House, as we would in English, a sentence could be translated to the house white. Semantics. So as we've been learning, semantics can be defined as those aspects of meaning that are unchanging across different occasions of utterance. So this is closely linked to phonology because there is an interchange of phonemes that produces different words, such as seat and sheet. So an example could be nothing doing, in Spanish meaning ni hablar, or doing nothing, meaning no haciendo nada. A student that's been educated in Spanish may bring some different English academic content cognates into class, so examples might be multiplicar, meaning multiply, or dividir, meaning divide. Words from a student's native language and cultural perspective can also carry a special associations. So, for example, the Spanish words for hammock, tobacco, and potato are all derived from Taino words for these items. So therefore, the vocabulary and meaning is affected by the history of the region, its political system, and previous environmental variables or indigenous groups. So pragmatics is the more varying part of meeting. It studies mainly conversational interaction, and in particular, what a speaker actually means by the words they are using. So we've included some culturally appropriate pragmatic behaviors. So Spanish people often initiate a conversation on a personal note. When they ask a question in the middle of a conversation, it doesn't mean they want to pry, it's just oftentimes a sign of consideration and caring. A child may use gestures more often when communicating than children that were raised in the U.S. When adults are talking, children often do not interrupt, and children show respect by avoiding down or away when they're talking to their parents, teachers. Spanish in the United States. Spanish is the second most spoken language in the U.S., with an estimated 41 million native speakers. About 12 million bilingual Spanish speakers live in the U.S., and it is estimated that in about 35 years, the U.S. will surpass Mexico and become the largest Spanish-speaking population in the world. So looking here at this map of the most commonly spoken languages other than English in the U.S., you can see that Spanish is that language for almost every single state. Spanish in U.S. schools. Spanish is the most widely offered foreign language in U.S. schools. The Immigration Act of 1965 allowed for an increase in students from Latin America. New Mexico has a 48% Spanish-speaking population, which is the largest of any state. In the U.S., we have different types of programs for those learning to speak English. We have ESL programs and bilingual programs. For example, ESL programs do not require that the teacher be proficient in the native language of their students. So examples of programs are ESL Pullout, where students are pulled out of class for a portion of the day in order to receive ESL services. This could be one-on-one or small groups, depending on the program and the school. There's also ESL Class Period, in which the ESL educator comes into the class to assist the ESL students. There are also bilingual programs. Here, the native language is used more prominently and in a combination with English in order to instruct. So there's early exit bilingual programs, which are much shorter, and they help develop skills needed in the general education classroom. And there's also late exit programs, in which their native language is used far more often during the program, and it goes on for a longer period of time. So this has been broken into 4 categories: spelling, accents, punctuation, and capitalization. So as for spelling, the Spanish writing system is phonemic. In other words, there is a close relationship between the graphemes and the phonemes. There are 27 alphabet letters that represent 24 phonemes, so therefore there's a very high correspondence. The Spanish alphabet is Latin-based and consists of 27 letters. The letter NA, or N, was added to the alphabet. In order to write words in Spanish, one must listen to the phonemes and then write the corresponding letter or grapheme. Some phonemes are spelled using more than one letter, as you can see here in parentheses. Aside from these examples, if there are double letters, then both are pronounced. So an example would be the word lier. You hear both of the letters in there. B and V, as explained earlier, both also sound similar in pronunciation, which can make it difficult to pick the proper grapheme when you're spelling. So an example would be votar, to throw, versus votar, to vote. When saying those words out loud, it's difficult to hear whether there is a B at the beginning or a V. For accents, they are needed to write in Spanish. So fluentu.com gives the example of papa, potato, versus papa, father. You can hear in the word papa, there is stress at the end because of the accent, and that makes it possible to tell the difference between the two words. Accents are also needed with question words. So examples would be cuando, que, como, cuál, cuántos. And when those words above are used with a question, you use the accent. But if they're used in a declarative sentence, an accent isn't used. So here's another example from fluentu.com. Cuando quieres ir? When do you want to go? You can see that the accent is used in cuando, versus cuando usted salga, cierre la puerta. When you go out, close the door. Here, there is no accent because it is a declarative sentence. Only the 5 vowels can contain accents, so consonants never contain them. And accents are used to tell the difference between homonyms. So an example could be sí, meaning if there is no accent, or sí, meaning yes, if there is an accent. There's also tú, meaning your, which contains no accent, and tú, which, as in the subject, which contains an accent. So punctuation, when writing a question, the question mark goes at the beginning and at the end of the sentence, and the first question mark is upside down. So an example would be ¿qué dices?, which means what do you mean? And this rule also applies when you use exclamation marks. So an example would be buenas noches. For capitalization, it's a little bit easier than it is in English to understand. So the days of the weeks and months of the year use lowercase letters. Religions and nationalities use lowercase letters. Titles of books and movies, etc. only capitalize the first word, while the rest of the words stay lowercase. And with proper nouns, only the specific name of a given person or place is capitalized. So fluentu.com used the example of Mount Everest, where only the word Everest is capitalized in the Spanish translation. Cultural norms, classroom implications, and tips. So, communication rules. We explained a little bit about turn-taking. Talking over others is not uncommon. Puerto Ricans, for example, often interrupt each other during conversation and finish each other's thought. I have to say, whereas in the U.S. and maybe an English-speaking state, when you interrupt others, it's seen as rude. Language, gestures, and closeness. So body language is very important. People tend to talk with their hands and use eye contact during conversation. Facial expressions communicate thoughts as well, and the way that you present yourself is very important. Gestures. When introduced to someone, two people shake hands. Female friends kiss each other on both cheeks, starting with the left. And many men use a two-handed handshake, where the left hand is placed on the right forearm of the other person. A friendly handshake is the customary form of greeting when meeting new people. Closeness. This is usually not a concern, and the cultural norm is hard. So, touching. Physical contact during a conversation with a Spanish speaker is accepted, and it is not considered to be an invasion of personal space, as explained. As for underlying norms and values, this is broken into gender, titles, age, and punctuality. So, with gender, it depends on the location. So, for example, in Mexico, it's traditional for women to be considered the homemakers while men work and support the family financially. However, with migration to the U.S., these roles have been largely impacted. So today there's higher numbers of women that are working outside of the home. So titles. You address people by their titles, such as señor, señora, professor, or doctor, when you are first introduced or in a formal situation. With age, men and women have more authority as they age, so elders in the community are highly respected. With punctuality, being a little bit late for an appointment or meetings is socially acceptable. However, in Spain, being 10 or 15 minutes late is not uncommon, but any longer than this requires an explanation. So, starting with implications of communication styles in the classroom, students from Spanish-speaking countries may have difficulty with turn-taking in conversation. As we stated before, it's socially acceptable to talk over others in Spanish-speaking countries, so this could easily be misinterpreted as poor behavior when this was perfectly acceptable in their native country. Cooperative learning strategies are very beneficial for students in Spanish-speaking countries for this reason. Talking is an important part of their culture and should carry over into their learning. Personal space. Others in school during conversation. And children may be more verbal around peers than adults, and an educator might assume that the student is unengaged, but really this could just be a sign of respect. Here are some tips for interacting with parents. Take time to learn about your student's family and their background. Depending on which Spanish-speaking country a family is from, cultural norms and beliefs may vary, so this is important to consider, and asking questions shows that you care and you're interested in where they are from. Using technology is very useful for working with families that do not speak English. One important tool to use might be ClassDojo or Google Translate. ClassDojo is a website that allows educators to update families on student progress, send them messages. In addition to this, you can post pictures and give students points, but the main point here is that the app can let you translate messages into 30 different languages. When communicating with parents and families, be friendly, use open body language, and be aware of your nonverbal cues. Comparing Spanish and English. There are similarities between the suffixes in Spanish and English. So in English, the suffix tion is added to verbs in order to create nouns. And in Spanish, cion does the same exact thing. An example would be asociación. The suffix mento in Spanish is often, and this kind of goes with the subject ment in English. So an example would be momento versus moment, both meaning the same thing. The suffix cia in Spanish goes with the suffix acy in English, so an example would be democracia versus democracy, which both again mean the same thing. There are also similarities in the graphemes. So if you look here at the Spanish alphabet chart, you can see that almost every letter is the same as English except for the addition of NA, which was added to the Spanish language. As for cognates, these are words, as explained earlier, that are spelled nearly the same and have the same meaning. And there are plenty of cognates in the Spanish language that are similar to English that can be utilized, especially with students that are trying to acquire vocabulary. However, it's also important to look out for false cognates, which are words that may be spelled the same, but they have different meanings. As for plurals, both Spanish and English languages can make words plural by adding an S or an ES to the end. And for capitalization and punctuation, both languages use a period, they use a question mark, and exclamation points. Contrasting Spanish and English. So this has been broken into alphabet, punctuation, as described before. In Spanish, there are 27 alphabetic letters that represent 24 phonemes, while in English there are 26 letters for 40 to 52 phonemes, so there is much less of a correspondence between the phonemes and the graphemes in English. So learning to spell English is a little bit more simplistic than it would be for those learning English. So punctuation, while both languages use exclamation points, question marks, and periods, in Spanish they use exclamation points and question marks at the beginning of a sentence and at the end, where the first part of punctuation is upside down. As for gender-specific vocabulary, in Spanish, nouns can be masculine or feminine and are often paired with the article el being masculine or la being feminine in order to tell the difference. So an example would be el libro, the book, or la escuela, the school. In English, we do not use gender-specific vocabulary. The subject of the sentence also has differences. So in Spanish, the subject does not always need to be stated. So an example would be I sleep in Spanish. It's okay to just say duermo instead of saying yo duermo, because here the verb duermo is conjugated, so the speaker can assume the subject I, whereas in English we need to state the subject in order to understand the sentence. As for prepositions, there are much less of them in the Spanish language. Is into, onto, beneath, through, in front of, and back of, and there are many more that I did not list. As for negatives, the word no becomes before the verb in Spanish, whereas in English this is more complicated because we have negative prefixes such as on, dis, in, etc. And this chart also shows some different sounds that Spanish does not have, so different digraphs, blends, initial sounds, final sounds, and different endings that you can look at. Difficulties Spanish speakers have with English. So we already went over many of the difficulties that are associated with Spanish speakers trying to learn English, but here are a few additional difficulties. So false cognates, as described, are words that sound and look similar, but they carry different meanings. So an example might be embarrassed in English, which looks a lot like embarazada in Spanish. However, embarazada in Spanish means pregnant rather than embarrassed. The letter sound correspondence in the English alphabet is also a bit different. So there's 26 alphabet letters for 40 to 52 phonemes, which makes it much more difficult to learn to spell in English rather than in Spanish. This is page 1 of our Works Cited page. And here is page 2 of our Works Cited page. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you.